Virgil's Aeneid and specifically teaching the politics of Virgil's Aeneid. My name is Victoria Rimell. I'm Professor of Latin here in the department, and I regularly teach the Aeneid. I also regularly teach, alongside my colleague David Fern, who does the Greek half of the course, an honours module on the politics of Greek and Latin literature. We don't actually specifically start with the Aeneid, we start with Ovid's Metamorphoses, but we do deal with, obviously, a lot of epic and the question of this thorny issue, how to teach the politics of Roman epic. So this was quite a tough brief, I thought, to give this kind of talk. And I come to speak to you fully aware that I think that the challenges of teaching Virgil's Aeneid at degree level are quite different from, though of course not altogether different from, the challenges of teaching it at GCSE to A level. So hopefully I can pitch this right. Hopefully I'll be able to focus on the overlapping bits of the Venn diagram, and where we can all learn from each other effectively, rather than me lecturing you. I'm going to attempt to pack rather a lot in the time that we have, and I think my talk, particularly in the first half, is going to be a little bit more abstract and theoretical and generalised, dealing with bigger questions immediately rather than going from the small scale to the bigger questions as David did, although we're absolutely on the same page in terms of that approach to ancient texts. So I'm going to try and share with you some of the ideas and tools that I think really work in the classroom, with a view to testing out, with reference to some current scholarship, the kinds of approaches to Virgil that will hopefully stimulate your students to do their best work and go some of the way to preparing them for university study. So, as I was looking through, and I know you don't obviously only teach to the test, but the kinds of tests that you give your students are indicative, to some extent, at least from my perspective, as to how you go about teaching this stuff. One of the ongoing themes was politics. Right, so that's what I've decided to focus on, because it immediately stood out to me as something that I would find it very difficult to teach, and I do find it very difficult to teach at degree level. So, questions about the relationship between poetry and politics in Augustan Rome, questions involving that loaded and problematic term that lingers stubbornly around texts like the Aeneid, aka propaganda, right? Optimistic versus pessimistic readings of the Aeneid, and of course their history, alongside reading an Aeneid as pro or anti-Augustan, as they link into the role of epic in inculcating values and ideals more generally, and how readings of the politics of the Aeneid adhere to particular interpretations of its protagonists. So, classically, the optimists tending to see Pius Aeneas as a kind of proto-Augustus, and the pessimists understanding him as a flawed, guilty hero who succumbs to furor, like a woman, like Juno, like Dido, or like an effeminate Trojan, or indeed like his enemy Turnus, in a reenactment or foreshadowing of Roman civil war. So these are the typical questions that are coming up in Class Civ A-level papers. The main purpose of divine intervention in the Aeneid is to glorify Rome. Do you agree? Do the characters of the Aeneid display Roman values? Does Aeneas become an Augustan hero, or a hero worthy of Augustus? Is the main purpose of divine intervention in the Aeneid to glorify Rome? And teaching around these issues presents particular challenges, I think. at both A-level and degree level. The exam questions that I've looked at themselves suggest or project all kinds of preconceived ideas about what literature is, what political work it might be doing in the ancient world, and particularly in Augustan Rome, as well as ideas about how we are to conceive of Augustus and Augustan ideology. So in this talk, I want to share some ideas about how to open up these questions in the classroom. And as I said, the first half of the talk is going to be more abstract and more theoretical, and the second half is going to point more specifically to some passages in the Aeneid and discuss how we might put these ideas into practice. Okay, so the first thing that I want to mention is that these are not just literary critical issues. They are philosophical issues, potentially, which can get quite complex. And when it comes to Virgil, they have a history. These questions come with a lot of baggage, a lot of scholarship behind them, a lot of scholarly debates and disagreements and taking sides behind them, right, that remain unseen for students, right, and so therefore need to be unconcealed for them in an accessible way. But the danger in trying to navigate these kinds of questions in A-level and early undergraduate teaching is that in simplifying ideas, as we have to do, right, for pedagogical reasons, readings of the Aeneid get flattened out, they get artificially polarised, right, and the text starts to lose the very vibrancy, the very intricacy that makes it political in the first place. So that's the first point, the first basic point I'd want to make. And the second basic point I'd want to underline is that the theme of the political can't be compartmentalised neatly, right? It can't be simply separated out from issues of character, form, and of other themes that we like to teach to when we look at texts like the Aeneid, such as heroism, the role of the gods, desire, space, geography, gender, etc. And it turns out that the political, or the question of the political, the question of the ideological drive of the Aeneid, right, also gets to the core of our understanding of epic as an art form. Right? So, these big questions that you've got here on the slide. Is epic, or is Augustan epic, a totalising form that strives towards a conclusion where all has been achieved? Or is it a baggy, maximising form, to use Philip Hardy's term in his book, Epic Successors of Virgil, which you have on your bibliography, whose scale and ambition means it is always encompassing further voices? That's an allusion to that famous book by R.O.A.M. Line, which has given rise to multiple responses, including responses which riff on that title, so furthest voices or other voices in Virgil. Is this an either-or question? Could it become a both-and question? And we certainly can't leave our own politics out of it, right? So this is a quote from a famous article by Duncan Kennedy, 1997, but still absolutely relevant, a seminal article for talking about these kinds of topics. The politics of Augustan poetry is inextricably linked with the politics of talking about it. It's on your handout. It used to be until, I did double check, it used to be until very recently available as a PDF online, if you just Googled it. I wasn't able to find it. So it could be that it's been taken off for legal reasons, but certainly when we set up a website following on from this day, we can put certain PDFs there, so I was going to put him up there for you. So what does it mean we can't leave our own politics out of it? Well, it's undeniable that a reading of the Aeneid's ambivalence towards autocratic power, for example, is much more acceptable to the modern liberal mindset, right? And is that reading that has grown up particularly in the wake of the two world wars and a sense of collective horror at fascism. It even, so this is the beginning of the slide, it even, we might say, gets to the core of what we think we're doing, what we think classics is, what we think our role is in the tradition of teaching that is classics. We're very aware these days in our 24-hour news cycle world that ideology often works through stories, through narratives that represent certain structures of domination as legitimate and natural. Traditionally, classical scholarship has been about tradition, and older scholarship on the Aeneid is deeply imbued with this notion. This must have occurred to you, right? So classicists have traditionally seen themselves as guardians of tradition and have viewed the text that they study, especially canonical epics like Virgil's Aeneid, as embodying truths and values, whether aesthetic or political, that are to be revered and internalised rather than analysed or questioned. So reading the Aeneid as, to put it in the extreme way, politically subversive, or to put it in a more neutral way, not straightforwardly promoting a single static political agenda, has also been, in the wake of the two world wars, about questioning the politics of classics as a field of study that is deeply implicated in imperialism, in colonialism, and in the education of elite white men. So I think it's important for students to have at least a sense of this as a starting point when you're beginning to introduce this notion of talking about the politics of the Aeneid. So to give a sort of potted summary of where the most ambitious thinking on the politics of the Aeneid has taken us in the last 30 years. Now, these are not meant to be sort of rules. I mean, that's a sort of outline of what I think is reasonably the critical status quo. And I mention this particularly because I get a lot of students coming in the first year who've been given this straightforward notion that the Aeneid is an example of propaganda. The problem is partly with that word itself, isn't it? That it is trying to get at something and describe something that is absolutely real, right? This is the prime text of Roman cultural identity from the early Augustan period onwards, for generations, right? But, of course, in the wake of Stalin, Hitler, etc., it has, amassed a certain, nexus of connotations that is potentially misleading. So the Aeneid is not an extended, and I'm parsing again the critical status quo here, where we've got to, what is now, where all scholars would be starting from. Right? It's not an extended propagandistic textbook. It wasn't commissioned by Augustus, another thing that undergraduates tell me all the time, it's commissioned by Augustus. Virgil wasn't compelled to say only what cohered with the wishes and interests of the emperor and his patron Maecenas. It's reductive and unhelpful, even to begin by thinking we must decide whether Virgil was really for or against Augustus. Literary texts are not, in any case, straightforward manifestations of conscious authorial intention. Right? We live very much in a post-Freudian world in which the unconscious counts, and what produces meaning is the interaction between audiences and artworks. And the Aeneid is fascinating in part because it has been read in so many different ways by different audiences. This is another quote from Kennedy, the next bullet point. He says in his article, "Conventionally, we tend to look on Augustus as a person, but, I quote, he was more significant as an idea." Augustan ideology, right, problematic term, but that's use that term, may have emerged in part as a set of political policies, as a evolving political agenda, but it was not a rule book. It was a collective invention, a set of forces, conflicting desires and ambitions. We know too, and I think that it's useful when broaching this topic with students to come up with modern examples of this. And certainly I'm not suggesting that they go read Duncan Kennedy. You might want to go read Duncan Kennedy and then sort of extract certain ideas, make them accessible to students. But this is an idea that comes across very strongly in this article. The idea that establishment discourse is not just shaped by, but also contains traces of its own opposition, right? And similarly, what starts off as oppositional can often be and is often absorbed and quickly incorporated by the logic of power. Indeed, power is strongly invested in doing that kind of incorporation. So think, for example, I don't know whether you know what this refers to. Big multinational companies today with their extremely canny and ubiquitous media presence. Companies like Pepsi or McDonald's have often attempted in their advertising to associate themselves with popular protest, things like environmental movements or gay rights or trans rights, so on. So this is the famous advert, the Pepsi advert that had Kendall Jenner set in this sort of image of, it was in New York, sort of anti-government protest. And she replayed that famous scene of the young woman approaching the violent sort of armoured to the hilt cop and presenting him with a can of Pepsi, which was kind of immediately kind of brought peace and harmony to the whole proceedings. And they were absolutely caned, quite rightly, for it on Twitter and throughout the media. But it just gives, it's an accessible example of what power tries to do and how that establishment power or establishment discourse and its oppositional partner are not necessarily only viewable as oppositions. They tend to overlap, they tend to eat each other up, they echo each other, mirror each other, and so on. We also know that because of the way language works, and especially because of the way poetic language works, and because of the way meaning is made in the process of audiences' active engagement with texts, that the complex fabric of poems like the Aeneid will always retain that potential for multiplicity, for excess, and so, in a certain sense, resistance, right? But you can read it both ways. It's to what extent you are going to construe those moments of paradox, contradiction, those furthest voices or further voices that we can identify in the Aeneid, whether you can also see them as operating in the service of power. That they're not necessarily, their oppositionality isn't necessarily, in contradiction with what we might call Augustan ideology. So, more samples then of what recent critics are saying in response to Kennedy, including my own colleague who's just about to have a baby, so she's not here today, Eleanor Giusti, who has written this fantastic book, came out last year, Carthage in Virgil's Aeneid. You might want to have a look at these books, by the way. In particular, I've left them all out for you. In particular, The Cambridge Companion to Virgil. I don't know whether you all have the old version of this, edited by Charles Martindale. Very usefully for you. It's just come out, 2019, so yeah, weeks ago. Re-edited, edited by a young scholar at UCL called Fiacre McGoran, with new pieces. Everyone's updated their bibliography as a new introduction and so on. So I'm going to be talking later about Richard Tarrant's piece in that, Poetry and Power, which I think is an excellent springboard, you know, if you want to sort of get students to just dip their toes into what professional classical scholarship looks like. So a really, really good place to start. So recent critics often articulate versions of the idea that the Aeneid itself can be seen to articulate doubts about what Augustus or Augustanism means, and to what extent it should be straightforwardly celebrated. And they often emphasise that Augustan ideology, insofar as we can kind of see it emerging in this period, was itself paradoxical, right? And so therefore it was itself poised to already accommodate oppositions and contradictions in the contemporary political discourse, right? To start with perhaps the Eleanor Giusti quote, right? What does she mean by that inherently paradoxical Augustan ideology? Well, she says the ideology of a regime that presented itself as a paradoxical monarchic republic, so both an autocracy and a regime of power that was trying to restore the republic, right, was shaped in such a way as to accommodate patent oppositions and contradictions, while at the same time encompassing the totality of Rome's post-crisis political discourse. Right? So introducing in a straightforward way those ideas that you know, about paradox not just being something that those motivated to see resistance might want to observe in the text, but something that was already there in the political discourse, I think is very useful and a very good way into sort of introducing students to both and thinking, as I like to call it, rather than either or thinking. Right, and Duncan Kennedy, I mean, yeah, he puts it in a much more provocative way in that famous article of his, when he says, the clear-cut distinction between Augustan and anti-Augustan breaks down completely when we try to pin it down. Arising from a static theory of language, it overlooks the fact that whatever the author's intention or however great his desire, no statement, not even made by Augustus himself, can be categorically Augustan or anti-Augustan. The traces of its constituent discourses were and still are open to appropriation in the opposite interest. And ironically enough, I think that our teenagers now are more able to understand that than any previous generation because of the complexity of the media world that we live in. Right? It's quite easy to see that there are all these voices circulating and how they coalesce into a kind of recognisable discourse, you know, is quite complicated, and things are ever moving, malleable, transformative, and contain, therefore, right, multiple contradictions. So I've given you a handout, and the first bit is a list of bibliography divided into two parts. So the first is a reasonable overview, I think, of the latest thinking on these issues, each of which, and particularly things like Nandini Pandey's book and article, that also serve as a kind of a useful archaeology of, you know, where we've been, what we've gone through in the last 30 years or so. And then under that, I've singled out things that I think would be suitable to actually give to 17, 18-year-old students. So bits of the Cambridge Companion to Virgil, chapter 1 of Pandey's book, chapter 1 of Richard Thomas's a very provocative book, and an old classic right now, almost 1993, Philip Hardy, The Epic Successors of Virgil, which is mainly on post-Virgilian epic, but has this really excellent, stimulating introduction that will get students into the bigger issues. Okay. I also think that it's useful to begin this topic of politics in the Aeneid by getting students to focus on some provocative contemporary appropriations of Virgil, which are deeply political. Do you all know what this is? Yeah, it's the 9/11 Museum, which I visited only a couple of months ago, actually, for the first time in New York. I've been talking about it for a few years now, but it's impressive in the flesh because it's absolutely enormous. Has anyone been there? You can kind of do, for students who are interested, you can kind of do a virtual tour online as well, which is really useful. Anyway, this was famously scandalous. They've still got Virgil under the quote. They used to have Virgil Aeneid. They sort of flattened it out somewhat. This is a quote from Aeneid 9, the poet's intervention and memorialisation of Nisus and Euryalus after their death. So no day should erase you from the memory of time. Why was it scandalous? Well, as many of you will know, not only does it contain that interesting ambiguity around nulla dies, right? What does no day mean? Does it mean no day from now on, or is it referring to that particular day of trauma? But you know, the main issue at hand is that Virgil's line remembers two young, hot-headed Trojan heroes who've just indulged themselves in a massacre and got caught because they were silly enough and vain enough to go running off with flashy helmets on. Right? So the issue is that the quote seems to memorialise implicitly, suggestively. I mean, it's more suited to memorialising the attackers on 9/11 rather than their innocent civilian victims. So I feel that one of the challenges, the broader challenges I have in teaching Latin literature at degree level is that, which David was alluding to as well and trying to provide solutions to, is that they tend to see these texts that they're presented with as completely eccentric, opaque, right? How could they possibly understand them? They're so removed from them in time, right? And if they've studied Latin, they also have that kind of psychological block of the language, and they remember the struggle of trying to understand Virgil. So one of the things we're trying to do is to get them to realise that the politicization of Virgil is a live issue now, right? And as they are emerging as political subjects, right, they might have, kids who are 17, 18, getting interested in reading about various political issues. This is precisely the time when they can read the Aeneid in an imaginative and creative way. Okay, so I would just use this as a stimulus. What do you think? What do you think of the responses to this? Is this showing us a different way of reading Aeneid 9? Right? Is it entirely tendentious and silly and a faux pas, or is it pointing us towards different things? Is it pointing us towards different ways of understanding what Virgil means for us in our culture? I mean, this is American culture, but we live very much in an Anglo-American world. Another example, which you may not have heard of, the Chilcot Inquiry into the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. This is a transcript which was commented on by a very famous Virgilian scholar who I've just done a conference on Virgil with, Jim O'Hara, in Rogue Classicism. I don't know whether you use that as a teaching resource. Anyway, this is a point in the Chilcot Inquiry in which Sir Lawrence Freedman asks, I think, a member of the intelligence services, what do you think of Dulfer's final report? And he says, it is a he, sunt lacrimae rerum, really. Right? Do you remember where this is from? This is Aeneas's response to the pictures, the frieze on the temple of Juno at Carthage, right? As he responds to representations of the Trojan War, right? Now, you could say this is just sort of public schoolboy speak or pseudo-public schoolboy speak for sort of shit happens, right? Life is tragic. Right? But what gets interesting is that Sir Lawrence Freedman says, would you like to elaborate? Very laconic. I think he says it all, and he says, all right, we'll stop there. And the chairman intervenes, and he misquotes Virgil. Now, you don't necessarily have to have students who know Latin to be able to convey this message to them. Tendebantque manus ulteriore amore. Now, of course, this is a misquote, right? It's a misquote of that famous line from Book 6. So I know you all love to teach Book 6. It's often been a set text in both Class Civ and Latin A-level. It's unmetrical, of course, right? And what was ulterioris ripae, right? So they stretch out those souls wanting to of tragic people who've died young, reaching out their hands to be carried across the Styx from the furthest bank, right? And some of them get accepted and others are refused. So, again, you could say it's just an unconscious misquoting. You could do all kinds of, Freudian readings of what the misquote means, and Jim O'Hara does a very good attempt of trying to say, well, okay, you almost convert it into an elegiac couplet. But the point, I think, for students is that, talking about the politics of the Aeneid, it's right there, right, in our contemporary political life, right? And it's also useful because it's just so opaque, right? What the hell did they mean? What was the meaning of trying to connect these two episodes, right? Does that give us creative ideas about how to juxtapose episodes from different books? Is the political meaning of the Aeneid, utterly appropriatable, right? What is the limit to its people's ability to appropriate it and make it serve their particular political aims? I think these kinds of instances, these kinds of examples are just useful for getting students to engage in a really active way with the political fabric of this text, but also to get them to see that it's not separable out from the very much politicised history of the reception of the Aeneid. Okay. We're also trying to get them to recognise the extent to which, differing political messages not only emerge in the course of our engagement with the text, right? They're also being tested out and self-consciously fashioned in the text itself, not least in its varying representations and iterations of the same bits of narrative, the same tropes, the same cycles of emotional reaction, of trauma even. So that's by way of introduction, really. Let's now turn to Virgil's text itself. Now, I suppose the reason I want to use Richard Tarrant's article in this book, I don't know whether you want to have a look, I'll pass it around, it's called Poetry and Power, is because it's on one hand quite provocative, right? And you've got to be able to direct students to kind of, questioning what he says and putting little scare quotes around some of the things that he says. But at the same time, it sort of posits this, as it were, poetics of ambivalence, as he calls it, right? So in some ways it's provocative, but in other ways it provides quite a balanced view, okay? And you might say that balanced view is a sort of flattening out, that ambivalence is a sort of flattening out. But what he starts with is the idea that the question we're often trying to answer is the question about to what extent the Aeneid is a fulfilment of the promise that Virgil makes in the poem to George X3. Okay, so that might be a good place to start, actually, with that poem. Because it's here that Virgil seems to anticipate writing an epic poem centred on Octavian. He says at line 16 of Book 3, "In the midst I will have Caesar." Right? He seems to suggest that this is going to be a poem about celebrating Octavian's victories, with glances back at his legendary Trojan ancestors. So he says in lines 34 to 6, "Here in Parian marble shall stand statues breathing life, the lineage of Zazarecus and the glorious names of Jupiter's race, Tros, our ancestor, and Cynthian Apollo, architect of Troy." Right? So one answer, and Tarrant puts this, I think, in an accessible way, is that yes, it is a fulfilment of this promise, right? But it's a fulfilment that is complex and in many ways unexpected. Yes, the entire poem with Augustus literally in its middle, right? So in the middle of the representation of the shield, Augustus literally in the middle of the prophecy of Anchises in Book 6, is a reflection on the creation of the Augustan Principate, yes, but an oblique and ambivalent one. So how is it oblique? I mean, how can one introduce this notion of obliqueness or ambivalence, looking at specific passages? Now, this is a digest here on the slide. I think perhaps I'd want to start with time. It's something that came to the fore in David's talk as well. The poem famously, and this is something that students can't really miss when they read the whole, has an intricate temporal perspective. Right? So action is set in the heroic past, but it's narrated from the point of view of the present. The war in Latium is, yes, a post-Homeric reenactment of the Trojan War, yet the opposing sides are to form a single people, and the war divides inhabitants of Italy in ways that are resonant of civil war. Right? So they evoke Rome's recent civil wars. So at 3 points, we get prophetic visions of events that lie far in Aeneas's future, but are in the past for Virgil's audience. So, prophecy of Jupiter in Book 1, 257 to 96, prophecy of Anchises in Book 6, 756 to 854, and then the representation on the shield in 8,626 to 728. These episodes, I mean, I know that they're often go-to teaching passages in the Aeneid. They allow us to make connections between heroic time and Augustan time. Right? So, for example, the idea that Aeneas prefigures Augustus to some extent, for example, in the Parade of Heroes, Augustan heroes in Book 6. And you know that can quite neatly be mapped onto the Augustan claim that he'd restored the Republic. But in all 3 of these episodes, the future is foretold by other voices or seen through other eyes. It's not seen through the poet's eyes, right? Jupiter, Anchises, Vulcan, right? And these explicitly Augustan presentations are sometimes quite obviously, right, at odds with the representations of the surrounding poem. Most obviously, the depiction of Roman history on Aeneas's shield, as Richard Tarrant puts it, I quote, displays the reductive approach typical of a commissioned work of state art. Right? All 3 episodes also clearly have a dramatic aim. They have a role in terms of characterization. They're all intended in some ways to boost Aeneas's confidence, to reassure him that his mission is going to be a success. So on that level too, we're aware as audiences of the dramatic and rhetorical purposes of these episodes. And in other ways, we're aware that these visions of Rome, right, the future mingled with the past, are partial, they're tendentious, they're selective. Leading on from that, think in terms of characterization. Now, a typical feature of Virgil's narrative and Virgil's Poetics is the strategy of doubling or redoubling, or, when it gets more complicated, fragmentation. So, however much Aeneas may some ways and in some passages be assimilated to Augustus, he never simply becomes his heroic equivalent, right? And that's because of this poetic strategy of doubling or fragmentation. So, for example, in his affair with Dido, famously, he begins to look a little like Antony, getting involved with another African queen, Cleopatra. She begins to look a little also like Jason, getting himself embroiled with Medea. Aeneas and Dido are, or resemble, twins, right? They are one of the key doubles or twinnings in the poem, if you like, not least through Book 1's simile of Apollo and Diana. They're doubles of each other in the sense that they are both exiled leaders who have lost a spouse. They're both trying to build a city. Aeneas, likewise, is not just channeling Octavian's famed pietas towards his adoptive father, Julius. In Book 10, when Pallas is murdered, and from thence on, from that point onward, he's also channeling Juno's anger. He's channeling Dido's madness, and the text signals that he is doing so explicitly in that famous final scene, where, as I said earlier, he also, in a sense, becomes the fiery Turnus, and he both is and is not the new Achilles, killing the Trojan Hector. So another way of thinking about doubling and fragmentation in characterization is through the trope of civil war. And that's, again, a way of connecting characterization to the political. As you know, the ghosts of civil war run through the entire war at Latium, so run through the second half of the Aeneid, the so-called Iliadic books. And those ghosts encode this lack of separation, if you like, between characters who are meant to be on different sides, both literally and symbolically. Civil war is, after all, the trauma of brother turning against brother. Okay. And it's worth pointing out to students that if we expand our view to take in, albeit briefly, some other key Augustan texts, so if you're to take a sideways glance at Livy's history, or Horace's Odes, or indeed Virgil's Georgics, civil war is a constant concern. Okay? And so Eleanor Giusti's book is particularly useful for this, just in her introduction. What these texts have in common is a sense of precariousness and uncertainty, the sense of being in the midst of a transformative process that is, in many ways, hopeful for the future, but is bound up with the trauma of return. Now, much has been written on the dynamic of repetition as it relates to grief and civil war in the Aeneid and in Augustan poetry more broadly. I think particularly of David Quint's famous book, Epic and Empire, Princeton, 1993. But Eleanor Giusti, my colleague, has quite an interesting riff on this in her 2018 monograph that I think you could extract, or it is quite an advanced book, so I wouldn't give it to students to read necessarily, but there are ideas that you can extract only just from reading her introduction, which I think would be really useful to engage students who are now so familiar, whether they realise it or not, with thinking about trauma in a kind of post-Freudian way. So in terms of damaging cycles of repetition, return, self-sabotage, self-harm, kind of thing. So in her introduction about how Augustan historians and poets deal with civil war, my colleague Eleanor explains it actually in terms of wounding and self-harm. So I'm going to read out a little quote from her. So she says, "To recall one's own personal history after the civil wars is a painful internal process comparable to picking at open wounds again and again." And she quotes here a bit from Ovid's Tristia, where he says, "It's as if there's somebody scratching at my scab again and again and again." Right? And Ovid, of course, takes that dynamic of repetition and doubling and mirroring to its furthest possible sort of experimental extreme. And in the pages that follow, she goes on to compare the image of Juno as withdrawn and messed up and dark and furious in Odes 2:1, Horace Odes 2:1, with the optimistic view of Juno in Jupiter's prophecy in Aeneid 1, so 279 to 82. So he says, Jupiter says in his prophecy, "Spiteful Juno, who now in her fear troubles earth and sky, shall change to better counsel, and with me cherish the Romans, lords of the world." So she starts off by saying, there are these different Augustan texts representing Juno in very different ways, right? But then she goes on to note that actually, despite Jupiter's prophecy, which we've already looked at as a particular perspective on events, right? She reminds us that very hopeful vision of what's going to happen to Juno, her character, is undermined already in the beginning of the poem, so line 26, when Juno is seen to nurse an eternal wound deep in her chest. So, what I'm getting at is that I think that the notion that the politics of civil war is operating in the Aeneid in this very sort of intimate, bodily way, right? And the process of working through the trauma of civil war is not just a public political process, it's also an internal process that we can trace in going on in different ways in different characters. I think that's a very interesting way, appealing way for today's students to get into this topic. And I think it's a good way of connecting the basics of characterization and the depiction of emotions, which they have to get good at A level, with the political work that the poem can be seen to do. Okay, just very briefly, the third point, thinking in terms of the oblique view, the ambivalent view, thinking in terms of philosophical tropes and dialogues between philosophical schools. So most famously in the final scene when Aeneas hesitates, then plunges the sword into Turnus. Critics have been divided as to whether embedded in the poem or in the poet's view we can see a kind of Aristotelian moderate view of anger as being allowable under certain conditions and certain circumstances, and to what extent, on the other hand, we can see the scene being more provocative in terms of Stoic theory on anger, as something that is, a horrific emotion that needs to be extirpated. Right? So, also thinking about if you're teaching the love and relationships unit as well, and trying to join the dots between Senecan philosophy, for example, and what you're doing in World of the Hero, that might be a good way of stimulating students. Okay, so this is essentially the conclusion to Richard Tarrant's re-edited article in that Cambridge Companion, which is going around, Poetry and Power. And I've put the whole of the conclusion on the slide because I think it's a good passage to think with. Right? There's much about it that is very convincing and a summary of scholarship, and there are also places where it looks to be more provocative. So I think you can kind of present it to students and get them to respond rather than just seeing scholarship as something that is a source of authority that they have to absorb and revere, okay, which is also something we're trying to do at university. So to see signs in Virgil of an ambivalent or pessimistic outlook is not to read him anachronistically. In fact, while explicit interpretation of the Aeneid along these lines is a relatively recent development, the aspects of the poem to which an ambivalent or pessimistic reading responds can claim to be the most basic or permanent, having their origins in the poem's conception of human nature. An optimistic or Augustan view, on the other hand, highlights elements of the poem that ultimately depend on a contingent set of historical circumstances, the hopes for renewal and stability raised by the ascent of Augustus. In that light, what calls for explanation is less the fact that critics in the middle and late 20th century began to articulate a pessimistic view of the Aeneid, than that an optimistic consensus prevailed for so long. Since Virgil's optimism is linked to his pride in Rome and his hopes for its future, a positive view of the Aeneid's import requires a reader who either shares that pride or for whom the concept of Rome carries an equivalently powerful value. In other words, just as the grounds for hope within the poem are historically contingent, so too is the perspective needed to read the poem optimistically. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I think that you could raise various questions around what that means exactly and what he is referring to, and to in our rapidly evolving political landscape, whether we are soon sort of coming near to that point where we do have grounds for, or there are grounds in certain spheres of our culture for reading the poem optimistically once again. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. We have until 12:15, don't we? We started a little late. Is that right? Yeah. So on the second bit of your handout, I wanted to give you some ideas about how to use what we've been talking about as a way into thinking about art and ekphrasis in the poem. Because one of the things that students will observe as they read is that Virgil frequently stops the narrative to depict viewers observing and responding to fictional art in the ways that implicitly comment on modes of interpretation that audiences apply to real texts, including this poem. So we already touched upon representations of the Trojan War on Juno's temple. This is the first passage. I picked out those three passages with some go-to bibliography. So first of all, first bullet point, monumental facades, the Temple of Juno at Carthage. The second, Ekphrasis, or depiction of a work of art, talking through of a work of art at the beginning of Book 6. And, of course, then the state-sponsored art, as Tarrant calls it, on the Shield of Aeneas in Book 8. So, do you all teach that passage in Book 2, the Temple of Juno scene? You might have taught it in the past. It is one of the set books, isn't it? I noticed that the prescribed books for the Aeneid, for the World of the Hero, are all the books apart from Book 3, which I hope just makes students want to read Book 3. What is it? What is it in Book 3 that you're not letting us see? Anyway, so the key point about that scene, right, is that we're viewing it through the tendentious gaze of Aeneas. Right? He's not alert to the fact that this is Juno's temple and Juno is his nemesis. He's not alert to the fact that Carthage is Rome's enemy in the future, right? So he classically misreads, he misapprehends, right? So that's I think a good point to start with is that simple point that we are seeing things through Aeneas's eyes, right? And that, you know, there is this sort of, you know, critical reading of him as being naive, as misreading, right? But there is also recent bibliography that challenges that view, and this is where Nandini Pandey, this is another 2018 monograph by a young scholar. It says, well, you know, there are other ways of thinking about that scene, right? If we stop at that feeling of readerly superiority, right? We're looking down at Aeneas. We know all the things that he doesn't know, or he's so silly, so emotional, and crying at me. He doesn't even realise that he's being, you know, he's walking into a trap. Then what are we missing if we remain at that sort of level of readerly superiority? Why should Aeneas's subjective interpretation necessarily be subordinate to authorial intent? Right? So I think just using recent scholarship on that question is a good way of getting students to really actively engage with you know, reading the politics of the Aeneid as, in the text itself, a question of interpretation. Right? It's showing us things from particular perspectives and, you know, teasing us almost to take the opposite view, or to fill in the gaps, or to notice what the character is not seeing. In the case of Daedalus' temper to Apollo, Cumai at the beginning of Book 6, and again in the vision